With a single swing, his giant guardian spear sliced his head from his shoulders. He didn't even have to use the matter disruption field. His soul-bound spear had been growing stronger by the day. The spear began to shimmer with a golden-purple glow as his soul energy had fully saturated the aura might. The gold came from his soul, which was touched on by the Emperor in the creation of his Custodes, and a fusion of Draig's and Albion's soul energy. It was fusing with his soul, and it had granted him a unique fusion of both souls. Once the diplomat lost his head, Justinian took a deep breath and roared to the sky. I am Justinian Arcadius Valorous Valder, and I give this challenge Xenos. Face me if you dare. There will be no escape from me. He opened his hand and brought out his helmet, which like his gear began to shimmer with a purple and golden glow. He placed it on his head as he watched as the ground in front of him burst open. Just as Remnosh said, he saw at the minimum 30,000 Martians with several more elites to lead them. They stayed in the back, but along with them, they brought their bioships which had taken combat modes with living weapons. The regular Martians were armed with what seemed to be armor that had psychic energy flowing through it. It was nowhere near what the elites wore, and it seemed to be something that the rank and file wore when in battle. From the middle of the army, he saw a giant Martian that towered over even other elites. This big bastard was 30 feet tall, and when Remnosh saw him, she shuddered. Father. The giant wore a full set of psychic armor, and he held a large psychic glaive. The quality of his gear was beyond what even his son and daughter had worn. Justinian suddenly felt the Martian attack his mind with a psychic attack. Almost mockingly, he retaliated with his psychic energy, causing a clash of psychics. Feeling this made the patriarch grin. You are like us, warrior? If you mean psychic, then yes. Have you finally come to kill me? Yes. You are an inconvenience, and you're enslaving my daughter to your will won't be tolerated. I shall kill her to cleanse this shame on my house. Remnosh in the distant sighed. That sounds about right. Master, can you just kill him? That is the plan. Rather than continue talking, Justinian clenched the handle of his guardian spear, which now also worked as a magic focus like a mage's staff. He surged his psychic energy and mana into the staff as a series of magic circles began to glow all around it. Seeing that made the Periach snarl. What are you doing? Come and find out. Before the Patriarch even gave the order to attack, he had finished casting. The speed at which he could form thoughts, shape mana, and psychic energy was almost unfair. He held his left hand out, and a deep dark red flame began to burn. In High Gothic, he spoke an ominous spell. I cast a rubric. He tossed Draig's fire into the sky, which made every Martian feel as if some god had just descended on them. That small fireball in seconds began to grow larger and larger as it fed on his energy. In seconds, it seemed that a new dark red sun had appeared in the sky, and this terrified the Martians. They began to flee, with some even trying to burrow themselves in the ground. Justinian slammed the butt of his spear into the ground and caused the rubric to activate. Draig's soul-destroying, never-extinguishing flames enveloped the sky. The Martians screeched in terror, as these were not mundane flames. These were dragon flames burning with psychic energy. This abomination caused the white Martians to scatter, but there was no escape. Like the original rubric, bolts of fire began to strike down at the Martian army. Each Martian that had the ill fate of being burned was reduced to nothing. Their psychic might was extinguished, and their souls followed. This included Severell elites, who could not extinguish the flames. It was impossible, as the rubric struck their chests, to not allow them to cut off their limbs. As for the father of Remnosh, when he was struck by a bolt, he began to scream as the flames would not stop. The more he tried to use his psychic energy, the more that was burned away. No, curse you! Justinian smirked as he lowered his spear, causing the rubric to begin to come undone. Though, he had one last use of the remaining flames, and like a meteor, they came down into the middle of the army. A massive explosion of blazing flames surged through the Martian army, killing any who were even touched by the flames. Justinian saw how Remnosh's father crumbled to the ground as the flames had not stopped burning. He walked toward the giant, who collapsed as his head burned to ash. You know, I got an idea. Justinian held his hand out and began to draw all the flames toward him. He didn't kill every Martian, as there were a few lucky ones who were further in the back and didn't touch the flames. They were the minority, as the rubric killed as many as it could. At a glance of the 30,000 Martians, only around 450 lived. Once all of Draig's dark red flames that never stopped burning were collected, he spoke to Draig. "Hey, since I am your host, this can't harm me, right?" "Correct." He removed his helmet and swallowed the flames. Both Draig and Albion did not expect that at all, and just as he expected, the flames went out in his gut. I thought you were going to draw out all the energy of them. Eating it works. I never thought to do that, but it does work, I guess. When in need, just eat it." He looked at the Martians who lived. "All of you, come here if you do not want me to cast a second spell." The survivors all instantly obeyed, which included several elites who had stayed in the back, including Remnash's brother. For now, he picked up the psychic glaive of the Patriarch as he was going to melt it down to see if he could not forge a second weapon. How common are mages with psionics? I think they're a thing in D&D, but where else? We're going to take a city-state. The first step to turning Mars into a forge world is Chapter 10, New Cadia. Once the 450 survivors gathered around in front of him in terror, he spoke with the glaive of their Patriarch held on his shoulder with his left hand. On his right hand was his guardian spear, which still was surging with energy. "Listen to me, and listen well. I have wiped out your army, and you are what remains. If you wish to live, you shall become my servants for the next 10,000 years. If you refuse, present yourself, and I shall take your head from your shoulders. Accept you." With a motion of his guardian spear, he cleaved the head off of Remnash's brother, causing the warrior elites with him to freeze in panic. Once he was dead, Justinian drew on his magic, as this was one of the spells he had been working on. He had refined the servitude spell he used on Remnash and created an actual spell now. He activated it, causing a purple glowing page to appear in front of every Martian. "Place a drop of your blood on the contract. Once you do, your souls will be mine for the next 10,000 years. You will not be able to attack me. You must obey my every order. You cannot lie to me, and you will do as I say. Make your choice. Sign yourselves to my service or a quick death." He saw that the regular Martians started to cut themselves on and place their blood on the contracts. When that happened, the magical page surged into their heads and fused into their souls. Now each one knew that they were forced to obey, otherwise they would end up dead. As for the elites, there were 19 of them, but it seemed one chose death. The large Martian walked forward and looked down at Justinian with a sneer. "In me. Very well." With the same brutal efficiency, he cleaved his head from his shoulders. "You were braver than most warriors, but foolish. The rest of you, what will it be? A mercy kill or servitude?" He looked at each of the 18 elites in the eye, but one stepped forward as well. "I shall pick death. Honorable. May you find peace wherever your kind rest." He cleaved this elite's head off, as well as he was not destroying their souls. His spear could do that if he wanted to, but he gave them this mercy. Once 17 remained, they did sign themselves to his service. They cut their palms and placed their blood on the contract sheet. Since Justinian fused his psychic energy and magic, this meant that they were bound through 2 systems. Even if they removed one, they still had the other, keeping them tame. Once the 450 common white Martians and 17 elites were bound to him, Remnash returned to his side. She had stayed far away from the rubric because of the Guardians ingraining fire as a fear for the Martian race. She looked toward Justinian, wondering what he would do. "So what happens now?" He turned to her with a smile. "Now, we take over a city-state. Take me to your city." Remnash rubbed the back of her head and spoke to the Martians. "You heard him. Dig a path to one of the tunnels. Make steps to the tunnel leading to the city." The Martians began to scatter forward and started to dig into the ground. The elites used their psychic focus blades to cut giant chunks out of the ground before their regular ones used their psychic ability and super strength to rip out chunks. With almost 500 Martians, the construction would take no time at all. He watched as his servants began to move massive amounts of red Martian earth. Remnash, in the meantime, decided to explain some things about her people's cities. My people live underground because the Martian surface has a terrible climate, even for us. The lack of a proper atmosphere makes solar radiation a constant, and despite us Martians being unaffected, our livestock and crops do not take the temperatures well. As for the Custodes city-state, which I came from, it was considered a weaker city-state. Our total population consisted of 120K in total. You just killed almost 30,000, so the population is now 90K. Most of those numbers are of non-warrior castes who grow the livestock or the crops, or even the craftsmen who make our psychic-focused weapons. He wondered something. Tell me, what are the castes of your people? She began to explain them from the order of weakest to the strongest. At the bottom are the laborers who are only around 7 feet tall. They have less strength, no heat vision, and weak psychic abilities. They are the ones who tend to our livestock and grow our crops. Among them are those with different skills, the diplomats, crop and livestock tenders, and even the ones who work in the mines to harvest or in precious gems. Above them, in ranking while still being weaker, are those we call the shapers. While still having weak bodies, their ability to shape psychic energy is extraordinary. Since our people live underground, we do not use fire since we fear it. Instead, the shapers are the ones who cut refined metal or with their psychic energy. They turn it into our psychic-focused blades, which are exclusive to the warrior elite, which I will get into. Above the shapers, but less prized, are what we refer to as soldiers in your tongue. They are average, born with strong bodies, heat vision, and decent psychic might, but despite being stronger than the shaper caste are seen as lesser. No soldier will dare offend a shaper, as the shaper could liquefy his mind before he could think. They make up the second largest amount in a city-state or kingdom after the laborers. At the top are warrior elites who are usually nobles. In every city-state below Mars, they make up the minority but are the strongest. Our psychic ability matches the shaper. Our bodies are mighty. Our heat vision extraordinarily powerful. And as nobles, we have access to things the lower castes do not. Psychic focus equipment like my sword, rings, necklaces, and bracelet. They save my life from your missiles by forming a psychic shield, which you will see soon. At the peak is the ruler of the city-state, kingdom, or empire, since my people, just like any other, are not a unified race. Wars rage all the time for mines, slaves, or territory. Hearing that made Justinian grin. That sounds perfect. It appears that my lucky stars have set upon me. I shall take over Custodes city-state and build a kingdom from there. I have been in this time for the better part of 13 weeks, and in the coming years, I will grow even stronger. Remnosh smiled as she glanced. Are you sure you are not a white Martian? That sounds like what a warlord would say. He reached down and patted her head. No, I am human, which some would say is worse. He turned around and saw how his servants were deep underground continuing the work. Already a set of stairs leading underground were quickly forming as tons of stone were piled away by teams of Martians. Honesty, the Martians are one of the best races as soldiers. Each one is psychically gifted, strong enough to lift hundreds of tons with ease. They have heat vision, just that they lack proper technology. With my magic, psychic energy, and genetic memory, I will start to build true technology to arm my city-state. With that, the upcoming unification war for Mars will be much easier. He chuckled as he was effectively going to be the emperor of Martian kind at this rate. He had nothing against the race, and he did not plan to enslave them all. He would show them why serving him was in their best interest. Just as he was thinking, a giant Martian elite who stood at least 22 feet kneeled at his feet. My lord, construction is complete. He nodded as he walked toward the stairs. Gather some men and collect every dead psychic-focused weapon and equipment. Any bodies that remain should be dealt with in your culture's way. Oh, and bring the patriarch's body. Only the head burn away. The elite nodded. It shall be done. He sent orders to Soldier Caste, which made up the entirety of the 450 white Martians that survived. He had 17 elites under his command, which he felt was good for a start. I want every elite minus you at my side. I will also bring with me 100 soldiers. Right? Remnosh stood next to him, while the elites moved in around him as guards. As for the 100 soldiers, they moved in front as forward unites. With him at his side, they began to descend down into the underground. The Martians had built them with elites in mind, so even their giant elites could move with plenty of headspace. Moving with 100 Martians was not even choking the tunnel. You would have to set up some guards here, as a big staircase was going to be quite visible later on. As they walked down into the pitch-black depths, his vision was not impaired. His pupils under his control grew larger to take in more light, but he could see better than an owl. As he walked deeper, he began to speak to Remnash psychically. Tell me more about this psychic net of your people. Sure, every major city-state, kingdom, or empire has one which they build around what we call our psychic pillar. It is owned by the ruling family, which is mine. My father was the patriarch or king of our city-state. He imprints his psychic mark into the pillar to show his status as ruler. Every Martian under his command, from the laborers, shapers, soldiers, and noble elites, then links up to the crystal, and it forms our psychic net. We can communicate with our people instantly, but of course, not everyone ever speaks to everyone. There are different smaller crystals throughout the city owned and maintained by a particular noble. Normally, the strongest meaning of the psychic pillar is now being maintained by my mother. You will need to either subdue her or kill her. Do you love her? No. She gave birth to me, but she did nothing more. Not all Martians are brutal, but mine were. They believe in survival of the fittest, and so many of my siblings have died at each other's hands. I just so happen to be the biggest rival to my brother, who you killed, as despite me being a little shorter, my psychic prowess and strength were not reduced. I am more nimble, which is why he took his chance to try to kill me. Thanks for that. You are welcome. Now she began to explain how deep the city-state was. Our city-state is around 6 kilometers underground, or almost 4 miles. I understand both. I take that any deeper, and the temperature starts to get bad. Correct. Our technology is not very advanced, as we use psychic energy for everything. Even our bioships are just another Martian creature. I will need one for myself, and I will bring great change to the Katias city-state. Though, I will be renaming it to New Cadia. Why? Just a reason. He cut the link and looked to the sky. The planet broke before the guard did. Cadia stands. Remnash would not get this, so he did not tell her. Instead, they kept diving deeper along with the 16 elites who surrounded him, which he would get a shapeshift soon. He already had their forms picked out, as their numbers were almost perfect. He was going to be getting his pre-March lookalikes as the leaders of his armies. They're going to need to be stronger, which is why he would begin to dive into his genetic memory and more magic taught to him by Drake and Albion. He would create a new breed of Martian using his own DNA, much like the Emperor. Without magic and his psychic energy, no one else would be able to make use of it. As he was in thought, they reached the end of the staircase. It ended in a tunnel, which they all entered. Once he did so, he could see and feel that it was much warmer than on the surface. Humid, even, which made him realize why all cities were underground. Deep underground, it was warmer, enough for liquid water to exist. He could also see that the walls of this tunnel had been smoothed out with both tools and psychic energy. He spoke to an elite next to him. How far is the city-state? This one was on the larger side of 25 feet tall. It is a kilometer in this direction, my lord. Good. Advance. Justinian and his servants moved forward. He might have to get his hands bloody to fully control New Cadia, but he was going to follow the Emperor's example during the Unification Wars. Be brutal and bring those who surrender to your side. This is going to be fun. Don't you agree, boys? Agreed. We dragons were never interested in ruling, but for you, that is a different story. There are millions of these Martians and army to be ruled under a new warlord. What will you call yourself? Good question. I will think about it. Any good warlord needs a title to inspire, don't they? Mars was going to go through an age of war, but in the end, it would work. As for Earthbackers, he had one bald mad genius in mind. Chapter 11. The Crystal Throne. As Justinian and his new servants continued through the pitch-black tunnels of the Martian underground, he began to sense a massive gathering of psychic energy. Here it is. The elite who said that it was a kilometer forward was correct, as very soon Justinian, his 16 elites, and 100 Martian soldiers emerged from the tunnel into a massive hollowed-out space. When they did so, they were spotted by some Martian guards who seemed to be of the soldier caste. When the Patriarch left to kill Justinian along with 30,000 of his army, they all expected victory. However, seeing that not only that out of 30,000 only a few hundred returned paralyzed them. It was even worse when the 16 elites surrounding Justinian spread out, and it was revealed what he held on his shoulder. The psychic weapon of their Patriarch, their king, was held in his hands. They got out of his way because no one could say they could defeat the Patriarch. If Justinian could not just kill him, and almost 30,000, what hope did they have? The guards at the entrance of the tunnel only numbered 30, but he spent psychic probes to each one. Inside their minds, he showed them all the Psymagic Flame rubric and made them feel as if they were there when he cast it. These Martians all fell to their knees in screaming fits of terror as they tried to push him out of their minds. Sadly for them, Justinian was just starting to unlock the genetic inheritance of the emperor. Without the warp, the emperor's psychic talents were converted to psychic talents. The sheer weight of his mind, which was constantly growing stronger as his soul did. When it came to souls, no baseline human could compare to a regular Custodes. He with 2 heavenly dragons was beyond even the Custodes. In moments, your Patriarch and almost 30,000 of your number were reduced to nothing. Think what will happen if I cast that spell once more, but down here. Step aside and don't even think of fleeing. Each of the 30 guards had families in this city, so they all stepped aside while shaking in terror. Seeing that made Rimnosh glance back up at him. What was that? I just showed them my memory of casting the rubric. Told them that if they tried to fight, I would cast it again, but in the heart of their city. Even she who had been forced by him to stand in front of a raging fire for hours felt all her training was for nothing when faced with the flames he used. You won't, right? No, I would lose my city-state. She shivered as she knew that her master was going to make a terrifying warlord. However, her white Martian upbringing made her begin to gaze at him how she would as a Patriarch. A true ruler, but there was only one title for now that was worthy. He had made a new title for himself, the Adeptus Dracons. Once Mars was under his command, only then could he think to call himself an emperor. As they continued to move forward, he began to see buildings. Everything was carved from stone with psychic might and by hand. Each stony building had several glowing plants growing from them. There was very little light down here, as the Martians did not use fire. Fire cannot burn on Mars normally, since combustion needed oxygen. Mars didn't have oxygen to burn, only carbon dioxide, so they used psychic alternatives. Crystals were treated by a shaper to glow with a golden light, and plants gave off a natural glow in the dark. Rimnosh squinted her eyes as she pointed to what Justinian could only call a pyramid. That is where the ruling family stays and where the location of the city's crystal pillar resides. Advance to the pyramid, prepare for battle. His enslaved troops did not want to fight their own kind of city, but they were under contract. Their own bodies moved against them, preparing for battle, as he instructed. The deeper they moved into the city, the more Martians he saw. They all had expected the Patriarch and his warriors to return with his head, but the opposite happened. The Patriarch was nowhere to be seen, and his prized psychic glaive was in his hand. Against Justinian, they had sent 30,000 soldiers, 20 elites, and a few warshapers. The unfortunate thing was that he had not even delayed and directly cast the rubric. He had wiped out the forward army with ease. The remaining population of the city now consisted of a majority of laborers, left behind soldiers who had lost the biggest amount of their population, and shapers who had not lost many. As for elites, 20 was not a big loss, but having them be enslaved against their families was. As before, Justinian used his psychic might to press onto the minds of every Martian he passed. They all were fed images of him casting the rubric and the knowledge that he could cast it with even more power. None dared to move against him until they reached the foot of the pyramid. At the steps leading up to the peak, he saw several Martian elite standing a few steps between each other. In total, he saw about 20, which was the same amount that he had been sent to kill him. He grinned as he moved forward to the front of his elites and soldiers. When the 20 Martians saw him with the weapon of their leader, they all felt rage enter their hearts. They all began to move down the steps with their giant spears ready to kill him. However, he just opened his right hand, which was currently free, and conjured more of Draig's deadly flames. One fireball, an example, should do it. He pulled his arm back and launched the fireball at one of the first elites who had been on the floor. In front of his team, which had been trained never to falter, did this time. The fire was already bad enough since the Guardians themselves had instilled in them a fear of fire. However, seeing Draig's soul-destroying flames strike near them froze them in their place. They all watched as the white Martian elite guard who was struck began to scream as the flames burned through his protective gear with ease. In his pain, fear, and irrationality, he rushed at his partner and grabbed him. "Help me." His partner was just dragged alongside him to oblivion as their bodies, minds, and souls burned away. Justinian opened his right hand once more to create a second fireball, this time 10 times larger. "That was just a warning. I can produce far worse than a tiny little fireball. These flames don't just destroy the body, my friends, but the very soul. If you do not wish to face oblivion, sign this." He activated his contract spell once more, giving the 18 elites a chance. "Place a drop of your blood on the page." These elites were trained to be absolutely loyal, never betray their master or even defect, but that was when they thought they would join their god Hronmir in the afterlife. If Justinian's flames could prevent that, they all instantly tossed away any honor they may have held. The fear of total nothingness was a fate worse than death, so they placed their blood on the page. With that simple act, Justinian now held 35 elites under his control, which he took full advantage of. "Lead me forward to the peak. I shall be taking the crystal pillar for myself. Soldiers, stand at the bottom and prevent anyone from rising to stop me." The 100 soldiers all gathered at the bottom of the stairs as his 35 elites led him up the stairs. As he moved, Remnash, who made 36, turned to him. "Do your flames really destroy the soul?" "They do. I try to not use them as much as possible because of that, but I felt forced to." This, of course, was a lie, as he could have just used regular dragon fire. It would have been much easier for him then, but he wanted to place the fear of oblivion in his enemies. If they knew they had an afterlife, they would be less afraid to die. However, if they found out that their afterlife was not possible if they died to his true flames, they would think twice before facing him. Remnash shivered, as that could have been her if she had not signed. Feeling her thoughts, he brought a hand out and patted her shoulder. Just now was he starting to realize it, but his apotheosis into a Custodes was slowly making him more like them. His mind was his to control, his emotions were there, and he held no loyalty to the Emperor. However, his emotions were slowly going through two extremes. As a possessor of 2 Henley dragons, his emotions were going in the direction of extremes, but as a Custodes, they were starting to weaken. He would need to find a delicate balance to not fall into either extreme. No emotion was not what he wanted, and unstable draconic rage was also not on the table. "Are you upset?" She shook her head. "No, just terrified." "How often will you use those flames?" "Not often. They're dangerous after all. But remember that I have an even scarier ability. A poison that destroys all organic matter and the soul. If I feel the need to fuse both, nothing will live." He didn't speak more as they made it to the very top of the pyramid. From what he could tell, the ruling family lived in the pyramid that could only be entered from the massive hollow opening at the peak. When he entered the peak, he saw another large Martian who he assumed was the mother of Remnash. She was around 25 feet tall, and she was currently on her knees in horror. She had felt her mate's last moments, and the link had fed her his last thoughts. Even now, all she could see were those dark red flames that seemed to have taken over her mind. Seeing her mother like this just made Remnash scowl. "Get up, your daughter is here." Her mother did not speak for several seconds before looking up at Justinian. She began to shake in place before she started to drag herself back. "No, stay away." He saw her lunge for the wall where she had hanged a dual-bladed psychic force weapon. He just squinted his eyes as he attacked her mind with his psychic pressure. Since her mind was already unstable, she could barely hold him off. While he fought her psychically, he spoke to his elites. "Subdue her." He saw 10 of them rush toward her, and they began to pin her down. Since Martians could phase through solid matter, they had means to prevent it. Justinian watched as they brought out some chains from their pouches. From what he could feel, they were treated with psychic energy. They were made to stop prisoners from phasing out of prison, but the chains were used to stop them. Once her body was held down, and he beat her in the psychic duel, he passed out. Once she was taken care of, he turned to the biggest thing that was held up here. It was a gigantic crystal that was glowing with psychic energy. Nearly every Martian in this city-state was linked to it and one of the psychic nodes of the noble families. Now, he was to take over, and the first step was to take over the pillar. Remnash, how do I do this? If the previous patriarch is overthrown, you just use your own psychic energy to place your own imprint showing your right to rule. He hummed as the crystal was even taller than he was, almost 3 times taller. So he reached out and placed a gauntlet hand on the crystal. He took a deep breath before he surged his psychic energy into the crystal. He began to force out the imprint of the previous patriarch and his mate, causing her to shake at the broken link. After that, the glow of the crystal died down, but he was just getting started. Once it was dim, he began to surge an ungodly amount of psychic energy. Slowly, the crystal began to glow from a dirty yellow to the brightest of gold in the center. Around it, a dark purple glow began to form as Justinian took control of the pillar. However, he was unsatisfied, and he slowly began to change the shape of the giant crystal. Under the eyes of the elites and Remnosh, the psychic pillar of their city began to shrink and grow out until the entire crystal formed a glowing crystalline throne made for Justinian. Once the psychic crystal pillar had transformed into a throne, Justinian took his rightful place and sat down. The moment he sat, he closed his mind as his control over the psychic pillar surged through the different nodes the nobles controlled. Their own pillars also began to change to suit his colors. In moments, Justinian was inside the psychic net formed by the white Martians over the city. The sheer weight of his psychic might pressed on the minds of laborers, shapers, soldiers, and elites all the same. This was just the effect of unlocking the power held in the Emperor's blood. His psychic might had already reached this point, but it still did not compare to the Emperor yet. Though it was good for now. I am Justinian Arcadius Valorus Valder, and this is now my city. Your patriarch is dead, your army is exterminated, and your elites are under my control. Any who refuse the new order shall face the same fate as your army. Suddenly, inside the minds of every Martian in the city, they were faced with the images of the rubric. 90K Martians started to scream as those terrible flames entered their minds. They could swear they felt them burn, even as memory. I can cast that spell at any time, but I am a merciful ruler. I will bring you prosperity or death. Pick. When he left the psychic net, he left a slimmer of connection feeding him information. In the coming months, things are going to be hectic for the white Martian race, now that they had him to deal with. He just had to get some technology which he would get from any of the billionaires he knew of. If Bruce wouldn't do it, then Lex Luthor, Oliver Queen, or Simon Stagg. The villains, they would of course are bound in some serious enslavement contracts. But for Bruce Wayne and Oliver, simple diplomacy would do. Who knew I would become a warlord? You never thought about it? No. After graduation, I was going to become an entrepreneur and make my own business. Guess I still can. You plan to show that cooperation between Mars and Earth is possible. Correct. Slowly. I can take over Earth until I own Mara and Earth. From there, who knows, maybe a great crusade is in order. In a few decades, or centuries from now, of course. He was not playing in years, as he would never die of old age. If he managed to become a perpetual, very little would kill him. Chapter 12. The Preparations. Once Justinian took his rightful place on his psychic throne, much like the golden throne of the Emperor, he closed his eyes and began to enforce his will already. He was a much stronger being now than he had been when he arrived. Enough to be confident against a majority of beings, with a few big exceptions. The presence, Lucifer Morningstar, Michael Demiurgos, the Anti-Monitor who killed Darkseid, and a few other beings. The gods were fair game, though, as he did not fear them. However, he had only been in the game of supernatural powers for 13 weeks. As long as he kept in his lane and played the long game, he would come out on top eventually. For now, he would set the foundation of his future empire. He raised his hand and used a very useful that Draig and Albion taught him. How to form a barrier or a bounded field, which he used to seal the entire city. Once the bounded field was set up, he smirked as he looked out at the gold and purple barrier. It shimmered with dragon mana and psychic energy, which was his specialty now. Since it contained both, you would need both at a high degree to break it, or just be stronger than he was. With that, he had effectively trapped 90,000 Martians inside a city with him. He leaned back into his throne as his psychic energy was flooding inside the net. This way, he was forcing his will into anyone connected to the net, making his power known. Not a single Martian, laborer, shaper, soldier, or elite could say they were a stronger telepath than him. That was not even talking about mages, because in this city they had none. Martians had evolved to have psychic powers, not magic. He planned to change that because he wanted to have loyal Simages who could use both powers. He could not be the only mage in his new Imperium. Without the warp to worry about, he could set up a proper intergalactic empire without worrying about the Immaterium or the Chaos Gods. He just had to worry about the multitude of powerful alien races, which is why he wanted the Martians under him. They were one of the heavy hitters, and with proper genetic modification, they would be even stronger. Even just their original burning Martian forms were very strong, and if he could create a caste like them with the ability to reproduce asexually removed, they would make excellent shock troops. As he was in thought, Remnosh and the other elites all looked around at the giant barrier that had been cast. Nothing could go in or out without his permission. Expect those who had been bound to his service, since he would need them to leave and enter the barrier for him at times. This was a good time to speak to the Martians to state his goals. The barrier shall remain up for 3 months. No one goes in or out. Enjoy your time with me. I know that I will. He rested his arms on his throne armrests, and he turned to his elites. Most of them were already connected to the net, except Remnosh. She took this chance to link back up with it, as when she had been left behind, she had been cut from it. Once she was linked back up, Justinian turned to her. Remnosh, I'm going to place my trust in you. So this psychic link doesn't mean anything to you, does it? She crossed her arms and leaned down to look at him. I know it is effectively a marriage to your kind, but to me, it is more of a convenience. Forgive me for the cultural difference. She just smirked as she sat down on his lap. You're good, my king. I'm just glad you didn't become some lovey-dovey simp all of a sudden. None of the elites around him said a thing about how forward she was, but he wrapped an arm around her very toned waist. He did love tone women like this for him. I'm going to make you a champion, Remnosh, a queen among your race. She reached around and wrapped her arm behind his head. Your queen, one of them. Fair. For now, he ignored her as he began to devour the information shared through the psychic net. This is how he learned more about the population of the city. There were only 2 noble houses besides the ruling family, and their numbers were not too great. Each one had around 15 elites, meaning that in a city that numbered around 120,000, there were only around 60 to 80 elites, which showed how small their total population was. Using his processing speed, he managed to get numbers for the castes. The laborers, which made up the vast majority, made up around 60,000 of the total population. They had made up half of the population before he wiped out 30,000 soldiers. As for the soldiers, they used a number 50,000. Now they were reduced to just 20,000, leaving 10,000 shapers and around 60 to 100 elites, ranging from full-grown to children. If his numbers were correct, he had killed 3 elites and the patriarch, so the number had gone down somewhat. He controlled 36 elites, meaning he controlled a little more than half of the elites. That was good enough for now, as he was soon going to control every elite in the city. Once he had cemented his rule and prepared for the unification wars of Mars, he would be ready. This is going to be long and tedious. Glad I have time. Once the barrier went up, the Martians were cut off from escape. They would not starve since white Martians were hardy, and they had supplies to last their vastly shrunk population. None of them, even the 2 noble houses, tried to cause trouble because they truly feared Justinian. The knowledge of the rubric and the soul-destroying flames had captured their hearts, filling them with dread. Everyone who looked up at the pyramid could see that he had cast several illusions to obscure what was going on inside. None had any clue as to what he was up to because he had not done anything major once he took control. Several individuals tried to find a weakness in the bounded field, but after the barrier retaliated and reduced the offenders to atoms, they didn't try again. What Justinian was doing was preparing for the wars that were going to come. To do this, he psychically bonded to 5 infant bioships which were kept by the ruling family. Bioships were a natural species of creature on Mars that were effectively living technology. According to Remnosh, the bioship race changed as a result of her master's thoughts and desires, which was apparent. Thanks to having access to not just psychic energy of exceptional purity from Justinian, and Dragon Mana, his bioships had already begun to evolve. They changed from small ships into baby Predacons effectively. He named them Predaking, Rampage, Devastator, Grimlock, and Grendel. Very quickly, the 5 small Predacons, as he was calling them, were changing to suit his desire. In a few years, he would have 5 living robot dragons that would act just like Predacons. He had time to wait for them to grow, so he went on with the next part of his plans. He took control of all the laborers, soldiers, shapers, and any infant elites inside the underground of the pyramid. There were only 5 at the moment, but they would be fully grown in 10 years. With that, the entire ruling family and what remained of their forces were bound to his servitude. The third major action he took involved Draig and Albion, as the 3 of them began to create new, stronger magic spells and rituals. While dragons didn't use many, being as long-lived as they were and the number of hosts they had had in their original world, they had learned a great deal. Even without the souls of the previous wielders, heavenly dragons like them did not forget. With hundreds of hosts between them who had used different types of magic, they were well informed. All this information was given to Justinian, who went on to create several useful rituals. The only one who was given any knowledge of his plans was Rimnosh, who he kept at his side for the most part. She followed him around and was his source of information. The final thing was that he collected all the psychic equipment that the army that attacked him had worn. He then melted that down alongside the psychic focus glaive of the Patriarch to build a forge room. Thanks to being the ruling family, their shapers had giant warehouses of metal, mostly iron, titanium, copper, zinc, tungsten, gold, and magnesium. Most psychic focus weapons were made of steel. What made them so strong was how they were forged with psychic energy rather than fire. He felt that it had its benefits, but these common metals would not do for his unification wars. He would need to find a way to produce something up to par with adamantium from 40K or vibranium. For now, though, he began to experiment to see how dragon fire reacted with mundane ore. The best one was steel because steel was the best mundane metal for swords and armor. He found that dragon steel was the best material for now and the easiest to produce. It was also many times stronger than normal steel because the flames came from a dragon-like Drake. When he added psychic energy, the metal became both in tune to mana and psychic energy. Once he had his answer, he forced the 5,000 shapers of the ruling family to help him, which caused the white Martian shapers extreme panic, since being that close to fire caused them to panic. He had ordered them to ignore their fears, which worked, and they worked alongside him. No one died, and he managed to create his forge room. It was primitive, which cemented the idea that he had to get a rich billionaire under his control to supply him with the technology he wanted. For now, once the forge room was up and running, he and his shapers got to work on reforging the psychic focus blades of his elites. The new psychic focus weapons, once they were forged, the blades surged with fire when psychic energy surged inside. Once an elite psychically bonded to their new blades, their fear of flames began to dissipate. They even received armor that had been forged in dragon fire, causing the gear to contain a spark of flame. Unlike the blades, the elites tried to refuse to wear the armor because the fear of the fire had been too great. He simply ordered them, which caused them extreme panic as the sets of armor went on. He let them panic for several minutes as they believed to be burning. Remnosh was also afraid when her armor went on, But unlike the other elites, she did not panic. She fought against her ingrained instincts to fear fire, as Justinian had shown her that it was just mental. Dragon fire was unique, but she had somewhat started to get over her fears. Justinian and his shapers also worked to start arming the remaining soldiers, which were only a few hundred. He had killed most of the soldiers that belonged to the ruling family. The 20,000 that remained belonged to the two noble families which he knew were pooling their resources. They knew he was going to go after them, and their time was shrinking. A month and a half after he had sealed away the city, Justinian and his forces were ready to move out. He was still going to keep the city locked away for 3 months, but once his forces controlled everything, he would be going to Earth for a diplomatic meeting. His true goal was to convince Lex Luthor, Vandal Savage, and Simonstags to fund him. He needed advanced technology to kick-start his inventions because he was smart and he knew what he had to do. But why start from scratch when he could just use what already existed to jump from? It would allow him to start recreating some of the technology of the 41st millennium. Much like an orc weird boy, his genetic memory had kick-started. He knew what he had to do, and it would make his unification of Mars much easier. His plans were starting to fall into place, but first he would fully control the two noble houses before anything else. Chapter 13. The Fear of Oblivion. I made a mistake about the growth rate of Martians. Miss Martian in the Young Justice TV show is 48 years old, but is 16 compared to a human. The Martians of New Cadia City began to feel like they were only lambs to be slaughtered once the barrier was set up. They could not escape, and fighting back was a fool's errand. After the terrifying display of the barrier retaliating and killing those who try to break it, they did not dare touch it. As for the servants of the ruling family who had been taken into Justinian's service, they would leave the pyramid and barrier. They were sent out to the mines to collect more or to be fed to the forges that had been created deep underground. Justinian had the laborers and shapers work alongside him to melt down iron or to drag in steel. The strength of the Martian race, even of weak laborers, allowed them to lift several tons without trouble. They could mine without the need for heavy equipment other than their dragon steel pickaxes and hammers. As for the noble houses of Zumdale and Priogenia, they locked themselves away in their stone estates. They could not leave, as the barrier also expanded underground, meaning they were trapped. As for Justinian, since he created his crystal throne, his powerful mind was a constant pressure in the psychic net. Everyone could sense his psychic presence, which was scarily growing stronger daily. No one could ignore it, but the day they dreaded came. The 3rd week of the 2nd month came, and the illusions placed over the pyramid went down. Every Martian looked up at the pyramid as they saw almost 800 Martian soldiers walking down the steps. Each one was wearing dragon steel armor, with large spears and shields. Image here. These equipment were not magic weapons, as Justinian and his shapers did not have the time to equip them all with those. However, the quality of this equipment was not low, as anything forged in dragonfire was powerful. These weapons could pierce Martian flesh with ease, and the soldiers wielding them were disciplined. The honor of magic weapons went only to his honor guard, which consisted of his 36 elites. Though his troops did not appear to be Martians, as he had them all shape-shift to appear human. The soldiers were Space Marine-sized, and their armor had a few symbols. On the chest plate was a 2-headed dragon rather than a 2-headed eagle of the Imperium. On the pauldrons were the symbols of a bear dragon skull and a sword with wings on it. As the 800 soldiers moved down with grim efficiency, Justinian and his 36 elites moved down behind them. He had not just been forging, as he had been training as well. The cause for the rise of his psychic might was that he was unlocking more of the Emperor's genetic inheritance. According to Draig and Albion, his soul was a bright gold, and purple. Even after almost 5 months with both of them, it still had not become the soul of a dragon. The good news was that from what they could tell, it was taking their power to grow itself. Even better was that the boosted gear and divine dividing were bound to his armor, which was part of his soul. As such, they were growing stronger as well. This had not been possible since God had placed limiters on their souls. With those gone, the 2 heavenly dragons were on their way to recovering their full power and even exceeding it. For now, though, Justinian focused his mind on the purges that were going to come. He was not just with his honor guard, as behind him were his 5 pet Predacons. Predaking, Rampage, Devastator, Grimlock, and Grendel had been growing. Bioships grew quickly as long as their master fed them with psychic energy daily. He had fed them mana as well, which caused the 5 of them to already be 45 feet long. The Predacons were massive and covered in weapons appearing to suit their namesake. Images here. He looked to his left and right at his honor guard, 36 Martian elites in full armor. Each set of armor appeared to be on fire, as a spark of Draeg's flames was trapped in each armor. The Martians who wore it for prolonged periods began to lose their fear of the fire as well. Image here. As for their wearers, he had made them all shape-shift to appear like Primarch-sized humans. Each one was 15 feet tall, which made them taller than him. He had shaped them all personally, trained them, and subjected them to magic rituals to increase their strengths. As for the weapons they wielded, they all had glaives or greatswords, except for Remnosh. She had taken to wielding 2 curved greatswords, and he had personally forged her armor in the soul, destroying dragon flames. He turned to regard her as she was surrounded by her own honor guard of only females. He had also shaped each one to suit his wishes like a chaos god, which shaped their demons. Out of 36 elites under his control, there were only 5 females. Behind his 5 Predacons emerged the War Shapers. Out of the 5,000 Shapers, he had under him only 500 were classified as War Shapers, those who could shape their psychic energy for battle. The War Shapers had magic staffs to allow them to better control it in their psychic nets. Their armor was light because Justinian had not worked on it. They had to shape the dragon steel for themselves, but once his troops were armed, he said his will across the net. By the end of the day, the 2 noble families will be subdued and under my rule. This would go peacefully or not. Be prepared for both. He got an instant response through the psychic net he shared with his troops. By your will, our king. Advance. The sound of 1,300 heavily armored troops and 5 Predacons marching was easily audible. The Martians down in the city all received a single message from Justinian. This is my will. The 2 noble houses are to present themselves for battle or surrender. As for the rest of the people, keep your heads down, and you shall be fine. As Justinian moved, he looked behind him at his 5 pet Predacons. Rampage, Devastator, Grimlock, and Grendel split into teams of 2 and go surround the homes of the nobles. If you see anyone attempt to fight back, blast them. The 4 dragons took to the sky, and, as he ordered split into pairs, Predaking stay behind, as he was going to be a ship or mount when he got larger regardless. He gripped his guardian spear as he moved. Remnosh, next to him, through their psychic link, asked a question. So what happens once the 2 noble families are subdued? Simple. Once they are compliant, we will set up New Cadia City and send a diplomatic mission to Earth. My goal is to bring true technology to Mars, so I can build a lab from where I can create technology from the 41st millennium. My helmet's memory banks have plenty of plans and designs to work with. Once I have prepared enough, the unification wars of Mars will begin and the entire planet will be mine. What about the Justice League? They won't like you moving against Earth while we white Martians are enemies to them. We tried to invade Earth 4 years ago, but we got pushed back by the Justice League and the armies of Earth. How many casualties did you cause? Remnosh thought back as she had not gone to Earth. I think the Martian invasion killed around 250 million people worldwide. He was honestly surprised they did not kill more, as that was very little. What is the total Martian population, if you know it? Remnosh had to think about this, but she remembered her father telling her some stuff when he still found her useful. In total, I think it is at 150 million in total. Our reproduction is slow, and so is our growth. We also war a lot against each other, and deaths are quite common. It keeps our populations down, and we have very little technology. Our only means of space travel is our bioships, and there are living creatures that were bred to be ships. Other than that, we are very primitive. Exactly. I will fix that in time to bring Mars to a true civilization. As for Terra, my true goal is to slowly begin to replace government leaders with white Martian infiltrators, especially China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and Afghanistan. Once those countries are controlled by loyal infiltrators, they will pass pro-Martian alliance policies that will aid me. Terra had resources that I wanted, but once proper infrastructure is set up here, we will move to the deeper solar system. Terra will not be invaded, as I do not want it to become an irradiated wasteland. It is the jewel of mankind, and I will not lose all its life because of a hasty invasion. Remnosh smiled behind her helmet. Sounds good to me. He focused back as he focused on his connection to his Predacons. Rampage, Devastator, Grimlock, and Grindel were already flying in circles around the large noble houses of the Zumdale and Priogenia. The actions of the two were very different, as Zumdale, which Rampage and Devastator were circling, had chosen to fight. Their 15 elites and their lord charged out alongside their war shapers and soldiers. Justinian squinted his eyes as he communicated with his forces. Move to House Zumdale. Fly now. He, his troops, and Predaking all took to the sky and began to fly toward the first house that chose to fight back. When they arrived at the first noble house, he saw his 2 Predacons locked in battles with 20 bioships. The living ships and their PLAs began to fire weapons the ships had created, mostly laser weapons that bounced off the cymagic shields his pets had. His Predacons were evolved bioships, so despite their seemingly unmaneuverable shapes, they moved magically. He watched as Devastator roared and surged with mana and psychic energy and almost teleported in front of an unfortunate ship. He swooped down on it and grabbed it with his metal talons. He tore the ship in half, killing it, and he lunged into the head of the creature to devour its PLA. His brother was no less brutal as he took a deep breath and began to spray flames all around him in a typhoon of cymagic flames. Justinian roared his orders through the link. Predaking, aid your brothers. Everyone else, descend. At his order, Predaking flew up to help his 2 smaller brothers finish the battle faster. Meanwhile, he and his honor guard were the first to go down to face the ruler of the House Zumdale and his honor guard. His army was larger as he had 10,000 soldiers, but they would not win the battle. The Lord squinted his eyes as he raised his sword. Soldiers, wear them down with your lives. Before anything happened, Justinian spoke through the psychic net which he controlled. Refuse that order. There is no need to lose your lives for a battle already lost. Join my side and earn my favor. The Lord in his rage looked at Justinian with eyes burning like fire-blasted rays of heat vision. Justinian did not need to even defend himself, as 2 of his honor guards raised their great shields and blocked the blast for him. You are a false king, not even a Mardash. Before the Lord could finish his words, the 2 elites at his side, which were his own sons, turned to him and impaled his body with their spears. The Lord roared in pain at the betrayal. Despite his power, the betrayal hurt even more. He was almost the same size as the former patriarch, but his sons wounded him. Before he could retaliate, his brother, who was standing behind him, stabbed him through the chest with his glaive. The other elites all followed the example and began to repeatedly stab their psychic focus weapons into his body over and over again. They cut his head off, his arms, and stabbed his organs until he was dead. Justinian, his honor guard, and soldiers moved forward as the elites did not stop stabbing their own lord until he was nothing more than a pile of bloody flesh. By the time he moved forward, the elites all fell to their knees alongside the soldiers and shapers. We surrender to your rule. Justinian smiled as he had barely needed to battle. The fear of oblivion was greater than any loyalty they may have had. Good. Sign the contracts. En masse, he created the servitude spell, and he watched as each of the Martians signed them, raising his soldiers to new numbers. His elites also increased, which were as they were named elites. Good. All you have submitted today shall earn my favor in the coming years. Remember this day as the day you choose to keep your souls intact. Behind him landed his 3 Predacons who all had killed the bioships sent against them. When the 3 dragons landed, the elites and former army knew they had made the correct choice. Now we move to House Priogenia. Let's hope they choose correct, as you did. He took to the sky, followed by his troops and the new ones he had taken from the noble house. He is not going to enslave every single Martian. Just the main ones of New Cadia City, as the rest will slowly be conquered.